Okay, for the next step, we're going to apply the stone texture to the portrait. So first, go into the files that I've included on the CD inside the stone portrait folder, and you'll find a couple textures inside that folder. You'll want to open up the one with the numbers 636214. Now that seems a little ridiculous for a file name, but I like to keep the file names of all my textures. That way I can give credibility back to the photographer who lended me the photo. But if you go through and you browse with the Adobe Bridge, you can see clearly that this is the texture that we will be needing right here. And I'll go ahead and double click on this. And it'll ask me if I can go ahead and discard the embedded profile, of course. I like to use textures that have lots of cracks. It just makes the whole effect after you're done. It just makes it so much more interesting. So if you'd like to use your own stone textures, go for it. You can go to a lot of photo websites and purchase or download textures that have lots of distressed cracks and other types of things. And so you can make it look as grungy as you want it to look, or you can just have it very light and have only a few cracks. So it's totally up to you. But I need to get this texture into my stone portrait image over here. So I can do this several different ways. I can just come over here to select all, edit, copy, and then I can just move over to the stone portrait image and come up here to edit, paste, and that'll paste that stone texture on a new layer. I think I'll come over to Layers Palette and just name that layer real quick. So I can type in here, stone texture. Or you can call it main texture, because it really is the main texture for the whole portrait. But I'll go ahead and activate that layer, come over here to Edit, down here to Free Transform. I'll hold down the Shift key and just position the mouse just at the corner of that selection and rotate that. And I'll play with it here, and I'll look at the cracks of the texture, and I'll position or rotate the texture based around the shape of the portrait or the person, just to kind of get a better idea on what I want to do here. I want to go ahead and move this around. This looks pretty good. Now I'm going to hold down Shift and Alt and just move this up a little bit, or resize this from the center out. Whatever you want to do, you just want to make sure that the texture is the same size as the portrait. So I'm going to fill the entire image here, just like this. Looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and press the Enter key on the keyboard to confirm that transformation. Great. Now, if you would like to get an idea on where the cracks and the texture will be on the portrait, all you have to do is go over to the Layers palette and lower the opacity, just like this. You see that? So now that we can see that we're going to have this really cool looking crack going over the top of his head. And we have some other cracks. I'll zoom into it here. Looks like we'll have this crack going over his nose and underneath his eye. I'll go ahead and hold down the space bar, move this down a little bit, and we'll have this great crack at the bottom here that we can utilize this crack and make that look like it was broken off on the bottom, and that'll help us create the stone bust effect for the museum. All right, looking really good. I'm going to go ahead and just turn that opacity all the way up to 100 one more time. Okay, everything's looking really great. Now, on the next step, what we must do is create a layer mask so that the texture is only covering the cropped portrait. This is really easy to do. So in order to create our layer mask of the portrait, all we have to do is hold down the Control key, which is the Command key on the Mac, and click on the portrait copy that we've created right here. So I'll go ahead and hold down Control, click on this layer, and you'll see that I'm selecting the layer's transparency. And we can sort of see an outline selected around the portrait. Well, this is great. So let's go ahead and make sure that the stone texture layer is still activated. Then come down to the bottom of the layers palette and you'll find the layer mask button right here. I'll go ahead and move this up a little bit, and you can see when I hover my mouse over that, it says Add Layer Mask. So I'll go ahead and click on that, and there you go. So now that we've masked just the portrait and everything else outside of that portrait is transparent on the stone texture layer. Alright, now it's time to adjust or change the color of the texture to give it that realistic stone color look. Let's come right over here to the layers palette, and I want you to hold down the Alt key on the keyboard. Come down to the bottom of the layers palette, you'll find a circular icon right here, and if you hover your mouse over it, it'll say Create New Fill or Adjustment Layer. So if I hold down Alt, Option on the Mac, a little menu will pop up, and that'll allow me to select Hue and Saturation. And the Hue Saturation New Layer dialog will come up on the screen. I want you to put a check right in the box that says Use Previous Layer to Create Clipping Mask. Go ahead and put a check in that box and click OK. And here's the Hue and Saturation adjustment. This will allow us to do all sorts of things to the color of the texture. I can desaturate the texture completely, making it gray, or I could just not go all the way down, but just leave it a little bit of color back in that texture, and I can adjust the hue, because some stone or statues have more of a bluish color to them, not necessarily completely gray, but they have this like cement bluish color to them. I just can't explain it. But what I'll do is move the hue around until I have that color. You see that? And I'll go ahead and lower the saturation just a little bit. So I maintain just a little bit of blue haze in there. Look at that. See, this is all the way gray. It's just kind of dull. But if I leave the saturation up just a little bit, I can have that little blue haze in there. I like that. I'll go ahead and click OK. All right, super. Now the next step, what we're going to do is blend the stone texture. Blend that texture in with the portrait below it. So come over to the Layers palette, and what I want you to do is activate the stone texture layer by clicking on it. Click on the stone texture thumbnail right here. After you've done that, come over here to the Layer Blending Mode menu and select Multiply. And that will blend the texture in with the portrait. Okay, it's looking pretty spooky right now. But you know what? It's a little bit dark. And most of the time when you do this, it's going to be a little bit dark. Okay, so the next step, what we must do is brighten the portrait, the stone portrait here, because you can see that we've multiplied the stone texture in with the portrait copy, but it's still looking a little bit dark. It's just not really that impressive. But to give it that real statue stone look, what we're going to do is brighten this whole image. So first, what I want you to do is click on Portrait Copy. Then what I want you to do is hold down the Alt key on the keyboard, which is Option on the Mac, and then come down to the bottom of the Layers palette, and I want you to re-click on the Create New Fill or Adjustment Layer button, the little circular icon here. Re-click on that, hold down the mouse, and select Levels. Go ahead and put a check mark in the box that says Use Previous Layer to Create Clipping Mask, because that's what we want to do, and go ahead and click OK. Now what I want you to do is move down to the white arrow slider here, and I want you to move that to the left just before our mountain starts here, the very bottom of our histogram mountain here. Just right about there, or you can go a little bit further, but I'm just going to put it right about there because you don't want to go too far or it's just going to remove and blow out all the detail in the portrait, and we don't want that to happen. So I'm going to move that over. Go ahead and click OK. Then I'm going to click on the Hue and Saturation adjustment at the very top in the Layers palette, and I'm going to do the exact same thing that I did to the portrait copy. I'm going to hold down Alt, Mac, that's the Option key, and I'll re-click on the icon to create the adjustment layer. I'll select levels, put a check in this checkbox right here, click OK. And then what I'll do is move this white slider to the left. And you can start to see this brighten up. Look at that. Now if you go too far, you're going to blow out the texture in the image, and so you might not want to do that. That looks pretty good right there, and I'll go ahead and click OK. Now again, you can go back to any of these settings, the levels or the hue and saturation, and readjust these. So I can go back and change the color of it if I want to, anytime. I can adjust the hue or do whatever I want there. That looks pretty good. All right, I'll go ahead and click OK. So it's looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and zoom into it a little bit closer here so we can really see what we're looking at. We can see that he's got this crack going over the top of his head, and he also has some other cracks on his forehead, on the face. So we've really taken advantage of the cracks that were in that stone texture. And we have this crack going along the bottom of his shirt here. All right, let's move on to the next step. Let me show you a really cool trick you can try. Let me zoom out of the image real quick. There we go. If you come over to the Layers palette, you'll see that we have one stone texture layer. However, you can double the strength of the texture applied to the portrait by clicking on it and dragging it to the new layer icon. Look at that. And that just intensifies the effect. Let's go ahead and zoom into it. Look at that. And you may think, well, it is a little bit harsh. It's almost too much. Well, we can go ahead and back it off just a little bit. So I'll just go right over to the stone texture copy that we created. Make sure it's activated. Then come over here to the opacity, and I can turn that down to 25%. So that means all we've really done was increase the texture by 25%. You can see this was before, and now this is after. You can also enhance it just a little bit more if you like. Maybe even 36, 35% will work just fine. There we go. Now let's go ahead and zoom out and see how this looks. All right. Looking pretty tough. All right, this next step is kind of fun. But what we're going to do is remove all the human skin from the stone. Because we really don't have portraits or stone statues with a 5 o'clock shadow. So we're going to have to remove those, and we don't have eyebrows as well. So a really fun and easy way to flatten out the skin while retaining all the detail in the portrait is to use a blur filter. But it's going to be a special blur filter. Go ahead and activate Portrait Copy, which is right here. And then I want you to come up here to Filter, Blur, and down here to Surface Blur. Now Surface Blur, well, it'll pretty much do what it's supposed to do. It'll just blur out the surface, but maintain the detail and the edges. It does a really good job. I'll go ahead and just adjust the threshold here. And you may need to experiment with this because all photos are different. But I want to adjust the threshold just enough so the hair on his chin here and the bottom of his face are about to disappear. See, if I don't have any threshold at all, we can still see the 5 o'clock shadow here at the bottom. So what I can do is increase the threshold, and that'll make that surface blur just a little bit more powerful. And you could spend a good 10 minutes just playing around with this if it's worth it to you. That looks pretty good. And it's a little tough because you don't want to remove too much. But you can see the eyebrows are no longer there. You can see this is what it was before, and now this is after. So I'm going to need to make a setting here. This looks pretty good. This is before, and this is after. I could probably go a little bit more. Maybe turn up the threshold just a little bit more. And I'll come back to that later if I don't like it. I can always reapply the surface blur later on. Looking pretty good. All right, I'm going to go ahead and zoom out. As soon as this is applied to the image, I can see my hourglass here. Okay, there we go. I'll go ahead and zoom out and check it out. And you can see that this was before. This is before we applied it. And this is after. Super. There's one thing that I wanted to stress, and it is that the more detail your stone texture has, the better your statue or your effect here is going to look. So what I would do over on the layers palette is to go to the texture layers and zoom into the image as close as you can and look at how the detail quality is. Because the better the detail of the texture, the better the effect is going to be. So I can click on these stone texture layers, come up here to filter, sharpen, unsharp mask, and I can adjust the amount of the sharpness of the texture. You'll want to increase the radius to at least 0.3. Anything below that for such a high resolution is not going to really show up much. And you could probably even go higher than 3. That looks pretty good. This is before. Before, after. I could probably go 0.4. Let me just move this down. And this is such a high resolution image that I could probably get away with going even more. You see that? But if the higher you go, you're going to end up seeing some of the JPEG artifacts and some of the compression, unless you're using a raw image or something like that. But that looks pretty good. This is before, this is after, so you can see how much I've touched this up. Before and after. You can see there's just a huge amount of sharpening there. So I'll probably just back off the radius just a little bit. There we go, 0.8. So if I remember this setting, I'll go ahead and click OK. I'll click on the original stone texture, and I can just come up here to filter. And if I look at the top of the filter menu, I can just go ahead and apply the exact same filter I applied before, just a minute ago. There we go. And I could probably back that off a little bit by using the Fade Unsharp Mask option, which is under the Edit menu. So I can fade that last filter setting that I did on the original stone texture. Fade that down just a little bit. This is before, this is after. There we go. I'll go ahead and click OK. Now let's zoom out. Now it's got a lot more texture. Okay, perfect. And again, you can always come back and add more sharpening later. You may find that after you finish the product, or after you get it on the stage with the lighting effects and the spotlight, you may look at it and go, well, the whole thing looks like it just needs an overall sharpening. If it does, then that's fine. And if you plan on doing anything for print, it's a good idea to make sure that it's over-sharpened in Photoshop before you send it off to the printer. It'll look so much better once you get it on paper. Okay, let's continue. All right, everything is looking great. Now what we can do is apply more texture to the stone portrait to give it more of a realistic, aged type look. I'm going to move over to the Adobe Bridge, and I'm going to select the other texture that I have here, the numbers 705274, and I'm going to go ahead and open up this texture and go ahead and click OK. And what I'll do now is just go ahead and resize this so we can see the texture on the screen. But you can see this stone, or stone wall, whatever you want to call it, is very distressed. It has lots of stains and, from who knows what. But I saw this and I go, that would be really cool to have that applied to our stone portrait, give it more of an aged look. So before I do that though, I'm going to move this aside just for a second. And I'm going to go over to the stone portrait image here. And what I'm going to do is load the mask that we've created for this portrait. So I'm going to hold down the Control key on the keyboard, which is the Command key on the Mac. And I'm going to click on any of the portrait layers. I can click on a layer mask, or I can just click on, let's see, this one right here, Portrait Copy, to load that layer's transparency. Because I don't want to apply the texture to the background. I only want to paste the texture inside the selected area here. Just the portrait. So I'll click on the topmost layer in the Layers palette because I'll want that texture, when it's applied, to be above all the other textures in the layers. Let's go ahead and bring that texture back in. I'll come over here to Select All, and over here to Edit, Copy, to copy that texture into memory. And then you know what? I don't need it anymore. I can just go ahead and close it. So the transparency of the Portrait Copy layer is still selected. So all I have to do is just come over here to Edit, Paste Into. Okay, so go to Edit, Paste Into, and we're pasting into the selection. All I have to do is select the Move tool on the toolbar and just move the texture up to the top of his head. So it looks like it's dripping down, like he's had some bad water damage, or it looks like it's been outside for 2,000 years. That's sort of the effect that I want to create. And while you're adjusting this, anytime, you can come over to the layer that contains the new texture that we created, and you can lower the opacity to see what's below the layer before you set it just right. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and give this layer a new name. I'm going to double click on it, and I'll just type in here water texture and press the Enter key on the keyboard. And let's go ahead and zoom into it so we can see it just a little bit closer. And by looking at things here, I can see that the top of this texture looks like it's running down, so I'll click on it, select the Move tool, and just pull this down just a little bit, just so I can utilize all the stains and everything here. Move that down just a little bit more. That looks pretty good. Okay, so we've applied the texture, but guess what? To really make this texture blend in, we do the exact same thing by blending as we did with the stone texture layers down here in the Layers palette. So I'll click on the water texture. I'll come over to the Layer Blending Mode menu and I'll select Multiply, and that'll blend it right in. Now we can turn the opacity up and get the full effect. Okay, great. That looks pretty good right there. I can go ahead and adjust or go back to adjust the opacity anytime. Now here's another fun part. Well, we don't want this line or this cutoff point of the texture going across the face. It's really not the effect that we're looking for. So what I can do is activate the layer mask that we created when we pasted the texture. I can click on that. Then I can come over to the toolbar and let's create a nice size brush with no harding at all. So I can turn the hardness all the way down to 0%. And let's create a good size brush about, that looks pretty good right about there. And by the way, if you would like to see the size of your brush that you're using while you're using the paintbrush at all times, just press the caps lock key on the keyboard. See, if you don't have, or if you have the caps lock key off, you will see the size of the brush that you're using while you paint. However though, if the caps lock key is turned on, you will just see a crosshair, which is probably pretty hard to see on my screen right now. So I like to have the caps lock key off, and now I can see the size of my brush. And what I'll want to do is paint with black, because we will be painting directly on this mask. And by doing that, we will remove the texture. Watch this. And since that we have set the brush as a soft brush, it's a smooth transition. There we go. Looking pretty good. So we just have the top portion of his head. Now, if you don't want that orange in there, because some of the orange could be a little bit distracting, and that's really probably not, if you want it that aged looking, or if you don't want that much coloration, all you have to do is click on the texture. I can just hold down the Alt key option on the Mac and create an adjustment layer, just like we did before. I can select hue and saturation, put a check in the box there, click OK, and lower the saturation. There we go. That looks much better. I'll go ahead and click OK. And I can also brighten it up. So I can activate the water texture, hold down Alt, option on the Mac, make an adjustment layer, and I'll select levels. Click OK. And then I'll just move the white slider here to the left to brighten up that texture that we've applied to the top of his head. Look at that. And I'll go ahead and click OK. And before I continue, I'm just going to go through here and make just a few more touch-ups to the texture. All right, next we're going to add some depth to our stone portrait. And what I mean by depth is that we are going to add shadows around the stone that make it more dynamic, so it doesn't look so flat like a photo. So what I can do is load the transparency of the portrait copy at the bottom of the layers palette. I'll hold down Control, which is Command on the Mac, and I'll get this little, my hand will turn into a little selection tool here, and I'll click on that layer to load its transparency. Then what I can do is just move to the very top of the layers palette, click on the topmost layer, which is our hue and saturation, and what I can do is make a new layer on top of that. So let's go ahead and name this before we continue, and we'll call it Shadows. And I'll press the Enter key on the keyboard to confirm that. So we have Shadows. Now I'm going to keep this selection active here. Go ahead and press D on the keyboard. That'll make the foreground black. All right, over on the image now, what I'll do is I'll just click the mouse outside of the selection and pull it in, move close right to the edge, and add this shadow around the portrait, just like this. You see that? And I'll do the shoulder here, and I'll go over here to this side. And if you need to, you can make that brush just a little bit larger by right-clicking on the image and adjusting the brush size. There we go. It just helps it stand out just a little bit more, gives it more depth, so it has more of like a three-dimensional look to it. That looks pretty good. I'm going to come up here to select and deselect. Great, you can see this is before, and now this is after. Okay, let's move on to another step.